works there. So. Welcome everyone, nice to have you here. I just want to do some introductions and get things underway. We might have a few others joining us, which is fine. So my name is Keith Powell. I'll be our sort of moderator. I get to ask the questions tonight, so we look forward to the answers forthcoming as well. So just on behalf of the Cranbrook History Center, which you're in tonight, we wanted to welcome you. I'm a board of directors for the Cranbrook History Center. And if you haven't had a chance to tour through the Cranbrook History Center, we encourage you to do so. There's lots of things to see here, including a great display of heritage railway cars and luxury cars, which we'll actually refer to tonight in our presentation. And we also have the archives, Cranbrook Archives here. We also have the paleontology exhibit. So if you haven't caught that, it's our oldest exhibit by far. So as I mentioned, Keith Powell is my name. I'm also a local author, published 4 books, and I'm pleased to introduce 2 Kootenai-based authors this evening to you, and we appreciate you coming out. We're also live streaming the event, so we have some people on Zoom tonight as well. So first of all, to my immediate left here, we have Terry Gaynor, and Terry is based out of Caslow. Terry and I go back a long ways. Terry used to own and run Newton Stage coach lines many, many years ago, and we both sat on a board, Kootenai Rockies Tourism, for a number of years. And so I was thrilled when Terry approached me a few years ago and told me about his first book, which was called When Trains Ruled the Rockies, and had an opportunity of interviewing Terry. I do a television show called Talking Kootenai Books for Shaw Cable, or Shaw TV, and Terry was one of our guests. To my left, a little bit further along the table, we have Michael A. Cohn, and Michael is from Belcourt area, is that correct? Michael has written a fascinating book on the Kootenai Lake Ferry System, so connecting the Kootenays, 100 years of Kootenai Lake Ferry service. So we're going to explore his book a little bit tonight as well. So I thought that we'd keep the format somewhat informal, and but I'm going to be asking some questions and give Terry and Michael an opportunity to answer those questions. Then we'll open it up to the audience, so if you have any questions that you'd like to ask either of the authors, that would be great. So Terry's second book, the one that we have on the table, and if you'd like to purchase a copy of Terry's book or Michael's book, they'd be happy to sign copies for you tonight. This is a little bit of their book launch for the Cranbrook area. And Terry's books are available through the cash register at the front, so you have to pay for them out there, and then you can bring them back in and have Terry sign them. Michael's, because he's self-published, his books are right here, and if you'd like to obtain a copy, Michael would be happy to sign them, and you can pay Michael direct. Is that correct? That's correct. Okay, good. Okay, good. So, as I mentioned, 2 fascinating books about the history of the Kootenays. And I don't know if you've noticed, but I guess maybe like any area, we have fascinating history, we have fascinating characters, and lots of stories. And the one thing I really appreciate about both Terry and Michael is that they've captured those stories for all of us to enjoy. And they've really put them down so that future generations can go back and look at these stories and really appreciate the history. So we're going to start out with Michael Cohn. Can you tell us, Michael, just maybe a quick overview of your book? It's a substantial work, 350 pages, literally dozens and dozens, not over 100 photos, and it spans a year, 100 years. So a substantial. What motivated you to put that book together?
Okay, thank you, Keith. Is that on? Am I on?
Should be pretty much.
Yep, you're on. Yep.
You can all hear me?
Right.
Well, thank you very much, Keith, and thanks to the Cranbrook Historical Center as well. I appreciate the opportunity of being here.
Yeah, here it is.
I'm turning it up. Closer to you now. Try now.
Hello? Hello?
Just try to speak closer to the microphone.
Okay. So I think in answer to your question, I'm interested in the,
That's a good idea. You switch microphone?
I've been interested in the history of steam navigation on Kootenai Lake for over 50 years. And one of the things I found is that it took me a long time to realize this, but when people that were involved in that sort of business, working on the boats, when they passed away, their stories went with them. And I just wanted to try to capture some of those stories over the years. These people became great friends of mine over the years. I found them to be fascinating individuals, and I learned some life lessons from them. And I just hope that in doing this book that I told the stories accurately and truthfully, and that they would be proud of them.
Thanks, Michael. Terry, give us an overview of your book. This is your second book, and actually you can use my mic. Or Terry, sorry. Just tell us a little bit about your first book and now your second book as well, if you would mind.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I'm certainly glad to see everybody show up. I've been a train buff all my life. I mean, I've been nuts about trains. My father was an agent at the Ferry System railway station in Banff. We moved there in 1948 when I was 6. And part of his position included a residence on top of the station. So I grew up spending an awful lot of time in our balcony looking down on the platform, watching people get off and on the trains. And that passion for trains has never ever left me. And when I was a kid, if we went on a vacation, I couldn't care less where we went to as long as we were on the train, because that was my vacation. For me, the journey was the vacation, it wasn't the destination. And from then on, I just was so interested in trains, and in my retirement, when they were redoing the back station, I thought, there ought to be a book about that. So that was my first book.
And just give us an overview of the next one here.
Well, the second book began as a project that I was going to present at the 2020 Canadian Pacific and Great Northern Historical Society Convention in Nelson. So I put together about a 45-minute PowerPoint and a small takeaway, only to find out about a month or two later that the convention was canceled because of COVID. In the meantime, I was also contacted by a gentleman by the name of Stephen Saddis, who is from Seattle. He has a company that makes documentaries, and he was working on a documentary called The Empire Builder, which was the life story of James J. Hill, who was the president and founder of the Great Northern Railroad. So I went down to Spokane and did an interview because I have a pretty good background in Great Northern's history, especially in Nelson and Castle area. And after talking to him and finding out more and more about James J. Hill and more about the Kootenays, I thought, there's a book here, and that was the genesis of this book right here.
Thanks, Terry. So we'll ask you some specific questions about that book in a moment. Michael, tell me about your book as far as the Kootenai Lakes Ferry System. It goes back 100 years, so that takes us back to, 1921? And maybe what was the ferry system like back in those days?
The ferry systems are an extension of the highway system, and the Kootenai Lake ferry system is no different. So in order for anybody back in the 1920s to travel from east or west, between the West Kootenays and the East Kootenays, you had to cross Kootenai Lake. And the only way that you could cross Kootenai Lake was on the ferry. Okay? And that remained the case all the way till 1963 when they built the skyway over top. Right? And that made the ferries a secondary road. But up until 1963, the only way that you could get across this province on the BC provincial, trans-provincial highway system, which later became known as Highway 3, you had to cross the ferry. And so because of that, if you, as you read this book, I think that you will find that all the economic conditions that transpired in the province over those 100 years are also reflected in the book. Where, you know, if you look at the Great Depression had a big impact on the Kootenai Lake Ferry System. If you look at the post-Second World War boom and development when the province was engaged in a lot of highway construction, the Kootenai Lake Ferry System was changed and modern ferries were put in and modern terminals were put in. If you look at it in today's standard, or the last few years, you look at the difference in all the vehicles that we have today. You know, we've gone from the old station wagon and the old car that used to pull the little trailer to motor homes, to fifth wheels, to B-trains. All of these things have had an impact on the Kootenai Lake Ferry System because for deckhands, they have to get proper sight lines underneath these huge vehicles and trucks and logging trucks and all that. So all of that reflects what's been going on in the economy in British Columbia. So I think you'll find a lot to parallel as you read through that book.
Thank you, Michael. Just before we go back to Terry here for a minute, Michael, one of the things that the local Regional Tourism Association promotes is it's the longest free ferry in the world. Was that always the case?
You know, there's a lot of controversy. I don't know where that idea came from, the longest free ferry ride. I think it was something dreamed up by the Nelson Chamber of Commerce. I don't know if it has any legitimacy to it, but it is, since 1963, it has been a free ferry.
So there was a toll.
Before that, there was a toll on the ferry. There was a toll on the ferry, and by the way, there was a toll on the Nelson Bridge, which was part of the trans-provincial highway system we were going with.
Interesting. So back to Terry. Terry, your book, When Trains Ruled the Kootenays. You know, whether we remember or not, or we learned this in history, you know what, I think our schools or high schools or maybe a junior high school could have a course on local history, because I don't remember ever learning about the Kootenai Railway Wars, but there was a real battle going on in the Kootenays, and it involved Cornelius Van Horn, James J. Hill, Daniel Corbin. Can you just shed some light? I know your book talks about this quite extensively. Shed some light on what was going on back in the late 1800s as the railway came in.
Well, it was a pretty interesting story, and it's kind of it's three characters and strong egos, big wills, and lots of ambition. To this day, I have to salute them because not one of them, Cornelius Van Horn, who of course who built the Canadian Pacific, and James J. Hill, who built Great Northern, and his counterpart in Spokane. None of them had ever gone to university. None of them were engineers, and yet they were amazing entrepreneurs and incredible railway leaders. And everything they learned on the job, so to speak. But it's an interesting background to it. When we were building the Canadian Pacific, James J. Hill initially was one of the founding partners of the CP Syndicate, along with Donald Smith and who was in our district, which is called Lawrence Coleman. And they were all buddies way back when in the 1880s in Manitoba, when they were building the Manitoba Railroad from Minneapolis up to Winnipeg, and when CP was first getting started. Cornelius Van Horn, he was working for the Milwaukee Road Railroad, who was a competitor of Hill's Railroad in Minneapolis. Anyway, Hill hired him away and set him up as the general superintendent of the Canadian Pacific, hence the building of the Canadian Pacific to the coast. They had a fall in 1883 after the syndicate was going for 3 years, because the Canadian government, who was the customer, they wanted the line to be all Canadian and to go over the top of Lake Superior. Hill, who already had a railroad across the bottom of Lake Superior, wanted to come that way to the States, to Minneapolis, then back up to Winnipeg. And of course, he would be the beneficiary of the Trans-Canada Railroad that went through his railroad. Well, the Canadian government would have no part of that because they wanted it to be an all-Canada line. And Bermuda's Gaynor supported the Canadian government and the CP syndicate against Hill's wishes. And Hill was absolutely enraged because Van Horn was his protege. He had hired away from a competing railroad, and he couldn't believe that he had taken a stand against him. And from that time on, which was in 1883, Hill withdrew from the Canadian Pacific Railroad Syndicate and said, "Damn you, I'm going to build my own railroad." And that's where he built Great Northern, very close to the Canadian border, right across the Seattle. And then Daniel Northern, who had built the first railroad from the United States to Canada, and went from Spokane to Nelson. In 1897, he noticed some strange stock market activity going on. The next thing you know, he was out, and James J. Hill had bought his railroad out from underneath him. So he kind of worked in the background for a few years, waiting for his chance for revenge. And that happened later when he built the Spokane International Railroad, connecting up to the railroad gap. And then he built his own town in the crow's nest called Corbin, and had a hugely successful mine on Cold Mountain.
Thanks, Terry. So fascinating history. So here are these dynamic characters that are involved in early Canadian history, all sort of clashed or was fighting over this tiny little corner in British Columbia. And it was just this heated battle. And as Terry mentioned earlier to me, it was all based on the fact of economic activity. So the coal mines were here, the silver, the gold. So they needed transportation, and they needed these railway icons knew that they needed to provide access, and if they could do so on sort of a monopoly basis, and that's why they competed. It's going to be very lucrative for them. So it's no wonder they competed so aggressively on that. So if you think Van Horn doesn't have any influence today, well, you actually took Van Horn Street to get here. So every little town in Western Canada probably has some memorial or street or monument named after Van Horn. So tremendous influence. Michael, we're just going to switch back to you. And Terry talked about the importance of rail travel into the Kootenays. Not only freight but also passenger, and really the ferry system or even the Kootenay Lakes stern-wheeler system was really an extension of that transportation network, and it got people moving. Can you just sort of explain what the connection between the railroad and the stern-wheelers and even the Kootenay Lake ferry system, how did that all work together?
Okay. A couple observations on Is that me? Did I do that? One of the things that you'll find in history a lot is the fact that when this country was being developed, or Kootenays in this particular case were being developed, it was always easier to start by putting stern-wheelers in place. Stern-wheelers could go to mining camps. The lakes were the highways for the boats, and the trains came later because they were more permanent. They were more permanent structures. So you had the stern-wheeler arriving usually beforehand, and they would run all the mining camps, run the main two towns. Everything came through the boats until the railways arrived. And then once the railways arrived, the boats sort of lost some significance. They turned more of their attention at that point to passengers and miners coming in and prospectors and lumbermen and families settling in the area. So for that short time, you had the stern-wheelers first, then sort of the trains, and they became more of an establishment. And then you had the development of the highways. And once the highways came and they could carry fruit and all that the normal stern-wheelers used to be carrying, including passengers, there was no more business for the stern-wheelers. The automobile put the stern-wheelers out of business for the most part.
Thank you, Michael. So let's just talk for a minute, Michael, about the current Kootenay Lake ferry system. When did the diesel ferries start?
Well, the diesel ferries started in 1947. It was called the Anscombe. People might remember that. It was a steel hull, steel car deck, and then above the car deck, on the boat deck and the bridge were all in wood. Very attractive looking boat. It was manufactured in Vancouver and then brought out and assembled here at Nelson. And it was what was referred to as a roll-on, roll-off ferry. In other words, up until that time, the stern whalers, if you were loading on the stern whaler, you loaded onto the side of it. It pulled alongside of the wharf, and you drove through the side door, the side gangway door. A roll-on, roll-off ferry is what we have today, where you just roll straight on and depart, and then when you depart, you drive straight off. And that was the Anscombe was a wonderful addition to what they had up to that point. Then in 1954, they built another ferry to supplement the Anscombe because they were always referred to it as an auxiliary ferry. And it was just because transportation traffic was getting so heavy in the summertime, they needed a relief. The Anscombe was running almost 24 hours a day at that point. And they needed relief, and the relief came in this auxiliary ferry, which is the Balfour, which is still in service. And one of the unique things about the Balfour is it had outboard engines. It had an engine on each side, on the port side, about 3/4 of the way back. And those engines could turn 360 degrees. That technology was developed for landing craft during World War II. That's where the notions of how that was done. So that was, at the time, I think the Balfour was the largest ferry in Canada with that type of propulsion system. Up until then, the traditional propulsion system, which was when the Anscombe, was a fixed screw and then 2 rudders.
Excellent. Thanks for the insight into that. And let's talk about the ferry system today. So what is it that we have today? And maybe just talk about sort of some of the particulars of our current ferry system.
The largest ferry on the lake right now is the Osprey. It was built in 2000, and it's an entirely much more sophisticated propulsion system than the Balfour had. The Balfour only had the 2 engines on the side, each side. The Osprey has propulsion, it's 4 pods on the hull. So the Osprey can actually go as fast sideways as the Anscombe could have gone forward. Much more maneuverable, much more easy to leave the dock and to get out into open water, and remarkably easy to stable within the terminal itself. So very highly sophisticated propulsion systems. And the new ferry that is being built right now in Nelson, which is due to be commissioned in 2023, it's going to be what they call an electric-ready ferry. So it's going to be actually operating on battery power, it will be fully electrified as soon as the BC Highways has got the ability to put the proper facilities in order to charge the ferry at each terminal. So we've gone from, we're now into electrified ferries.
So from stern whalers to electric ferries, I guess that's what they call programs.
In 100 years.
Terry, let's go back to you and talk about trains for a minute. One of the fascinating chapters of your book talks about the train that we have sitting out here in the Cranbrook History Center, which is the Sioux Spokane. And that was no ordinary train, was it? Can you just tell us a little bit about the Sioux Spokane?
I mentioned earlier, excuse me, my voice is getting a little croaky. I mentioned earlier about the construction of the Spokane International Rail Line from Spokane up to the border, and then connected via yak to the CP line through the crow's nest. That gave the CP a continuous line from Minneapolis-St. Paul straight through to Spokane, because CP's U.S. subsidiary was called the Sioux line, and they ran from Minneapolis-St. Paul and Chicago up to the border in Portland, Saskatchewan, and then to the main line at Moose Jaw. And CP and Great Northern, that was about the height of their competition, the Coopies. And at one time, Great Northern had pulled 16 lines into Canada, 12 of them were in British Columbia. And CP and the Shaughnessy, the second under their president Shaughnessy, decided they were going to strike back and they would take a shot at James J. Hill and the Great Northern in their own backyard, meaning Minneapolis. And they decided to build a passenger train called Spokane train Deluxe. This train was probably the most modern train of its day. It was the first train in the United States and Canada that had electric lighting throughout, and it was an absolutely gorgeous creation. They built 6 complete train sets so they could have daily service every day. And they ran from St. Paul up to Moose Jaw, through the Crow's Nest or Medicine Hat, through the Crow's Nest, and then that Apple went down to Spokane. And why Spokane? For those days, it was the financial capital of the mining industry, not only in the Silver Valley and Idaho, but of course also for the Kootenays, Rossland, Nelson, Cassia, and all that. It was an immensely popular train, and it was very successful. And in fact, in 1908, it was extended to run all the way to Portland through an agreement with the Union Pacific. All of this was intended to get at James J. Hill and the Great Northern, and it worked. However, along came World War I, and that was the end of the Sioux Spokane train Deluxe. And it was then broken up into different pieces on the Trans-Canada Limited, on the Atlantic Limited that went to Boston from Minneapolis. And much of it was sitting right out here in the tracks now, including the tail and car. And it has been preserved here, and it's a wonderful addition to this area that have been here. But it was really the crackerjack train on this day.
Thanks, Terry. So you can take a tour of that train anytime you stop by the History Center as well. So Terry, you mentioned the fact that this was a competitive move, and interestingly enough, the Spokane Sioux from Spokane to Minneapolis was 40 miles shorter going through Canada than it was through the United States. So that was their sort of competitive advantage for many years. So even just because of the geography,
It was just a gentle curve like that.
yeah. So amazing. So yeah, a great story for sure. So Terry, let's just go back for a minute, and I know your voice is was going to hold up for us.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Nothing to do with age.
Just tell us about some of the economic activity that was going on in the Kootenays that sort of got these railway veterans excited.
Well, I guess it all began with the huge silver strike in Nelson at the King Mine. It was the biggest silver strike and the richest silver strike in North America at the time. And that was followed closely by the discovery of gold in Rossland. As you probably know, Red Mountain is an extinct volcano. And the interior, which the miners did a pretty good job of following out, incidentally, was filled with veins of pure gold. And in fact, in terms of today's prices, over the life of the Lagoa mine in Rossland, they took out in today's value $82 billion for the gold. So it was a big deal, and there was a lot of reason for railroads to get involved. Because somebody had to haul the ore to the smelters, and the smelters were not just in Canada. There was only one smelter, the big one in Trail. There was also one in Cranbrook, Washington. There were smelters in Spokane. There were smelters in the Silver Valley near Wallace, Idaho. And of course, then there was the copper strikes just west of Rossland and Trail over in the Grand Forks area. But they had huge copper mines at Phoenix, which was at one time a small city of over 10,000 people. And by 1919, it was gone. It had about a 20-year lifespan, and then that was it for the copper. It ran out. So it was all mineral. It was mineral. But it really opened up this corridor of British Columbia. And the fact that there was more than one railroad involved probably duplicated services in a lot of instances, but it made it economically more feasible for a lot of the businesses in British Columbia because of the competition between the railroads. So it was a win-win for British Columbia, making up for the railroads.
Nothing like competition, right? So Michael, let's go back to the ferry system for a minute. You alluded to in your opening comments the impact of various eras on the ferry system. Now let's talk about the Depression and then maybe post-war as well. What were some of the impacts that had economics and maybe the economics of the ferry system?
Well, we're all familiar with the Great Depression, and I guess we're all familiar with the fact that a lot of families from Saskatchewan and Alberta were displaced and headed west towards British Columbia. And they did so in caravans, they did so in old cars, their whole belongings were packed when they came out this way. Tremendous hardship, and absolute, I mean, my generation can't appreciate that type of hardship. But in order to get through to the Okanagan, anywhere they were going in southern British Columbia, they had to come through Cranbrook, and they had to go to Preston, and then they had to go up to the ferry, and then they had to cross the ferry, if that's what they were doing. And the number of, and a lot of times, the people, when they got to the ferry, they didn't realize that there was a toll on it, and they had to pay that, and they didn't have the money to pay it. And there was a lot of heartfelt stories where people bartered with the pursers, bartered with the mates, bartered with the captains, in order to exchange goods for toll fares across the lake, with the idea that they were going to come back by the way and pay back and get their belongings back. But they never did. I've talked to several people that they would say they were showing a whole drawer load of jewelry, watches, rings, everything imaginable, anything they could barter to trade to try to get across. They did so. And they chickens, gramophones, spare tires, all of that stuff was bartered in order to get across the ferry. And sometimes these, during the Depression, there was a lot of single men working at road camps. They would work their way up the East Shore Highway, offering to do jobs for mending fences, cutting firewood, anything they could do. They would probably spend the night in the barn, and the next day they were off and paying to get across on the ferry. So there was a lot of hardship, and that went on for a decade. And as I mentioned earlier, you have to keep in mind that if you bartered something with the purser or the captain, the idea was that you were going to come back and pay him, because that was he paid for your fare out of his pocket. He held the good that you traded, if that was the case. And there was one instance, just as an example, where a family of, I think, 8 from Alberta showed up at Great Creek to cross, and they didn't have the money to cross on the ferry. So the wife asked to speak to the captain, and she came and went up to the wheelhouse to speak to the captain, and she said, "I will give you my wedding ring if you'll let the family go across, and we'll come back within a year and pay you back." And they did. They paid him back. He still had the ring. She came up to the wheelhouse and gave her the ring, and she gave him the money. So that's just, it's hard. It is so hard to comprehend that by today's standards. Like, I've never been able to fully understand if they couldn't pay to get across the ferry. Where were they going? I mean, it was only a couple dollars, right? And that was the way it was in the hungry 30s.
Interesting glimpse into history. Michael, I have some time to spend on Kootenai Lake. We go to Kootenai Creek campground, and we enjoy laying on the beach and looking out on the placid lake. Kootenai Lake isn't placid all the time. It requires a skilled captain to captain those boats. Is that correct?
Absolutely, very, very much so. The one thing that people don't realize by today's standards is that the vertical rise on Kootenai Lake prior to the dams being established in 1967 was 20 vertical feet. That's the difference from low water to high water. So when you have that much change in water, you've got change in currents. You had a tremendous amount of driftwood floating down the lake across the ferry's path. You had current. Current was a big factor for turning a boat, and a big factor for docking. They had driftwood would accumulate inside the wing walls of the wharf, so they had to be very careful not to bust the propeller or break the shaft on the outboard engines. And the Balfour, by the way, with its outboard engines, it was more prone to have damage to its shafting, whereas with the Anscombe, where the propeller was down deep in the water, it wouldn't have that problem. So currents, wind conditions, the prominent winds on the Kootenai Lake are north and south. And by the time they get up to where the ferries cross Kootenai Bay and Balfour, they're rollers. They are just unbelievable in size, and they can come up very fast. Storms on that lake can come up very fast. So there was always caution, always awareness in terms of navigation when it came to crossing the lake.
So it speaks to the skill of the crew, the captain, of course, and really his support crew as well, which we sort of take for granted, but I think there's been some, well, back in the circular days, there were some boats that sank, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct.
Terry, let's go back and just talk a little bit more about your book for a minute. You know, you talk about a lot of the special trains, you talk about the history of railroading, what we might call the Kootenai Railroad Wars. But you also have a chapter in your book which I found fascinating that I guess we would call not so special trains. And can you give us a little bit of insight into that saga and why you included it in your book?
Well, we're talking about the Japanese internment camps, and I've been in Denver, that area, Casco, Greenwood, all from the interior. And the reason I included it is because they mustered Japanese from all over this province in Vancouver, in the horse barns in Hastings Park in Vancouver, where they were there for about 4 or 5 months, and then CPR had tracks that ran right into the Hastings grounds because of the annual fair that they had there, the circus and all that. And they loaded the Japanese onto the CPR trains, and they had these not so special trains. They took them to Greenwood, the Grand Force, to Spokane City, where they got on the ferry, or the stern of Spokane City, transported them up to the camps in New Denver. And the reason that I included it is I got talking to an old college friend of mine named Ken Shimizu. And Ken, when he was a young boy, he and his family were all the Japanese that were interned there. And we had often had many chats about it. And he was the one that brought to light to me in a conversation about how they were all sort of herded like animals into the park of Hastings. And how for the first 2 or 3 days they were there, they were cleaning up the stables because that's where the families slept. And then they opened them onto these train cars, and they had absolutely no idea where they were going. They never saw their possessions or their luggage again. They lost their homes, their businesses, their boats. And I just thought that was an era that needed to be part of that book, because without the railways, they wouldn't have ended up in the interior. And that's how that sort of transpired.
It's a powerful chapter. Thank you for including that.
Just adding to what Terry was saying, they used the Kootenai Lake ferries to transport the Japanese internees from Proctor to Castle. And I think they made about 5 or 6 runs on that. And it would be after hours, usually in the evening. And they'd load the people on at Proctor, and then they would disembark at Castle.
Interesting. Yes, sad legacy that Canada is still living down, I think. Michael, just going back to your book for a minute, this to me looks like a lifelong work. It's not a book that you put together over the kitchen table. There's a lot of research, a lot of work. And the one thing many things that I've learned about your book, but the one thing that really stood out in my mind are the tremendous photos that you have in the book, as well in your book, Terry. And some of these photos have never been seen before because they're from your private collection. Can you just talk a little bit about some of the photos?
That's absolutely correct. There's a lot of them. They're from my collection. Because I've been involved in it, so interested in the history of navigation on the lake over that long period of time. I collected a lot of photographs, some of them from individuals that I was talking with. Some of them being acquired over at postcard shows and that sort of stuff. And more recently, being able to buy a few items off of eBay. But I was very fortunate. My father-in-law was a professional photographer, and we went to the trouble of digitizing the collection. And he spent hours, countless hours, making the images sharp and clear, and that really paid off when it came time to produce this book, because the graphic designer that was putting things together, he used the pictures, he commented on several occasions, these are incredible pictures. And there's some the more recent stuff are from families that were involved in the ferries after the 40s or 50s and stuff. And they contributed a treasure trove of materials that you wouldn't have seen before. There's actually, and the reason for that in some regard is the fact that there's been a few books here and there written on the stern gears. Get Affleck did them back in the 80s, Bob Turner did some in the 90s. But there's nothing written on the ferries themselves. So the ferry component, which is mostly in this book, are all images that just haven't been seen, like family images and stuff like that. So I'm very happy, very proud of this book, and I'm happy to see these images come forward and being available to the public.
Thanks, Michael. We're going to wrap this up in a couple of minutes, but before we do, Michael, can you tell me maybe a favorite story of the book? And Terry, I'm going to ask you the same, so you can think about that. Any stories that sort of stand out in your mind?
Well, there's one in particular. I always found it very humorous, but I'll let the crowd decide for themselves. During the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, fishing was very good on Cookie Lake, and there was a lot of resorts having tournaments and derbies and whatnot. And one of the favorite spots for fishing was at the outlet of Cookie Lake, where you go from the main part of the lake, it narrows quite sharply into a slight channel, and then you go down the west arm from there. But at that outlet area, there would be, at times there would be hundreds of boats out there. Some of them trolling going one direction, others going another direction. There'd be those boats fishermen out there jigging with their boats, and there'd be fly fishing. I mean, it was often said at times that you could walk across that outlet from boat to boat. Now, getting through, that was directly in the ferry's path. And so what would typically happen is he would have to start blowing his whistle, and he may even have to slow down if people weren't shearing off to each side to open up the channel for him to go through. Because there's not a lot of room there. There's not a lot of room for the ferry to maneuver. And the ferry is a commercial vehicle, so it has priority. And on this one instance, the captain told me that he was going across, he was going from Cookie Bay to Belfast, and he got into the situation where he started tooting his whistle, and most of the people sort of veered off to the side and gave him room to move by. But one fellow didn't. And so he kept whistling, and this guy wasn't going to move. He just was not going to move. So what the ferry captain did is he slowed down, and he actually slowed down enough that he went over and bumped the fisherman's boat with the front of the ferry, which must have been a horrific experience for the people, occupants of that boat, because you'd be under the guard of the deck and it would be dark. But he bumped it. And then there was a whole string of profanity from the fishermen and a bunch of gesturing. And the suggestion was that he was going to meet the captain at the Balfour dock and straighten this out. And he did. He was at the dock before the ferry landed. As he was backing in, he jumped over the chains at the front and ran up the car deck to the boat deck. And he was just about going to go up to the bridge deck when Captain, who was Captain Jim Houston, came out onto the bridge deck at the top of the stairs and sort of stood there. And this Captain Houston was a pretty broad-shouldered, tall fellow, not the sort of guy you'd want to mess with. And this guy took one look at him, turned around, and left. He wasn't going to tangle with that guy.
Interesting. Thank you, Terry. Sorry.
Well, I was like, back in 1895, the Castle in Santon was a narrow gauge railroad that was being built by Great Road from Castle over to Santon. Santon, as in 1900, was a small city of 10,000 people, which doesn't even exist today. But anyhow, they were building a rail line over there, and at the same time, Canadian Pacific was building the cusp on the cusp of Spokane Road, destination also Spokane. In advance of the rail line getting there, Canadian Pacific built a station and a freight shed. And they had a couple of rail car crew bunkhouses. And Castle and Sackett was actually the first railroad to come into the town station. And one thing in the middle of the night, as Canadian Pacific was nearing, they sent a special train of their own in the middle of the night from Castle with about 70 employees on it. They got to Sackett. They hooked a cable to the CDR station to the locomotive, and they backed it up and they tore down the CDR station, they tore down the bunkhouse, and then they pushed the bunkhouses that were on a set of side tracks off the tracks. They then cut the telegraph wires so that the CD could call for help. Then they all jumped back on the train and went back to Casco and denied everything. But it was a real battle. It was a pitch battle. Pickaxes and the whole bit. They confronted the CD crew in Sandon. They also destroyed the trestle that came from Whitewater just before it entered Sandon, and CD had to rebuild that. Strangely enough, no punitive action or legal action ever occurred. CD built a new station about 200 yards away. And I've always gotten a kick out of that, and I found that story in the archives of Nelson, and it's a great read.
Thank you, Jerry. Yeah, so lots of colorful history there for sure, and no wonder they call it the Kootenai Railway Wars. Okay, so I'm going to just open it up. Might have some questions from the audience. Feel free to ask a question. If you like, just maybe stand up or yell out loud if you have a question. Terry or Michael, I'm sure would be happy to answer it. Anybody have a question?
Don't let me up that.
I have a question about the ferries. I don't know if I understood with the mic problem, but how did you say the ferry got from Vancouver to the lake when it was you said it was created in Vancouver?
Okay, what I was referring to is that that ferry was a riveted hull. It had a riveted hull, and so in those days what they would do is the shipyard at the coast, in this case, would build the hull, and build the whole ferry actually, and what they call lock them up, where they put metal rods into where the rivets would go. So they would actually pre-build the whole ferry, and then they would take it apart, and they would ship it up in sections, and ship it up to the shipyard at Nelson. And then at Nelson, the riveters would go to work, and they would reassemble it in its entirety.
Did they ship by road or by rail?
Well, it's a good question. They actually, in 1947, for instance, they shipped by the Kettle Valley Railroad. Okay, but when they built the Osprey in 2000, Kettle Valley Railway isn't around any longer, and they were brought up in trucks, which limited the size of the modules that they could take on board. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Joe?
Terry, you mentioned in your economic activity with the railways, you focus pretty much on minerals, and I wondered how you see lumber and logging in that. I mean, I know that a number of big industrialists came up from Minneapolis, St. Paul into this area, built logging camps, put in their own railroads, shipped onto the CPR, and it went, back all the way back east. Do you see that as a major or a contributing factor?
Well, it really was, and quite honestly, I didn't draw much of the logging activity in the book, although I do mention that after the cusp was established as a town, it wasn't really a mining area, but it was a ferry stop, and it was the next stop before Arrowhead, which is where the train from Brooksville came down. But the industry that built up around the cusp, and of course the industry that started Castlegar, was the logging industry. You're absolutely right. And I think that as the mining petered out, is when the logging industry really sort of came into its own. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Thanks for the question. I just did some research and I wrote an article for Cranbrook tourism recently about the Scandinavian tax. Of course, they say the CPR would never have built the track across Canada if it wasn't for them, because they hand hewed most of the railway ties that made up the CPR across Canada. So, and a lot of them came out of the Yak and the Bull River drainage areas. So the Cougars contributed to the rail line sea to sea, right out of our own area. So a tremendous story if you ever have an opportunity to look into that history. Any other questions from the audience? Just wanted to turn your attention just to our gentleman in the back here. So this is Gordon Sherry. Gordon is our program director responsible for things like Ed Talk. And the reason that we're calling it Ed Talk, you probably know this, but it's a little bit of a takeoff on TED Talks, which is sort of a business lecture series. Ed Talks is a little bit of a tip of the hat to Ed the Elephant. So if you remember back in 1926, which I wrote a book about, the elephants came to Cranbrook on a circus train and escaped. And it took them 6 weeks to round up all 13 elephants. And we have a little bit of a monument down at the head of Baker Street there that talks about history. And so again, just another colorful incident in the Cougars, which sort of adds to what Michael and Terry have recorded in their books. I'd like to extend a warm thank you to both Michael and Terry for being our guests on our first in-person Ed Talks for quite some time. And we really appreciate you being here. Gordon?
Second, we had Janice Strong last month here live.
Oh, okay. Yeah, John is okay. Sorry about that. Second, well, that's still pretty positive, I think. So, great. Thank you, Terry. Now, you know, your library is not complete until you have both of these books in your library. So, if you'd like to go home with a copy, the books are free, but when Michael and Terry sign them, their signatures worth whatever the price of the book is. So they'd be happy to sign it for you, and I can testify to the fact that both of them are just good quality reads, gives us an insight into the wonderful history of the Cougars. Thank you for taking time out this evening and being here as part of our guests.
Yes, thank you for coming.
Is there a way we can pick up the Creighton's book? Are they in the bookstore here, if we don't get it tonight?
Yeah, they're in those Huckleberry books. They'll be here at the Railway Museum as well. Yeah, so at the gift store, or just ask for the front desk. And like I said, if you're buying Terry's book, you just have to put it through the till here. If you're buying Michael's book, Michael can handle the transaction right at the table there. So thank you again. We appreciate you coming out. Thank you, Terry. Thank you, Michael. We appreciate you both being here. Have a good evening.